remember the interview was standard for the first 90% of it, right? They ask you simple questions. Oh, why do you think you're going to be good for this job? What are your qualifications? Tell us, what you like to do in your personal time, those kinds of things. And then the last question came up, and it was Dick Tubb, the deputy director, who asked it. He said, Dr. Cox, imagine that you are a United States senator and you have to vote today on whether President Clinton should be impeached. How would you vote? I was shocked. It's not the kind of question I expected to be asked.
No, that's the hell of an interview question, isn't it?
It sure is.
Hello and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and this podcast brings you the most crucial conversation in healthcare and physician leadership today. As promised, we are hitting some key areas of attention this month. With summer heating up and hurricane season upon us here in Florida, we're getting into emergency readiness mode. And today's guest, Dr. Gerry Cox, recently retired as the Associate Deputy Undersecretary for Health, Quality and Patient Safety at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which in plain English means that he was the Chief Quality and Patient Safety Officer for the largest integrated health system in the United States, with an annual budget exceeding $180 million. Dr. Cox grew up in a tiny town just south of Boston and ended up in another tiny town, this time in New Hampshire, to earn his undergraduate degree in biology from Dartmouth College. He then earned his medical degree from UMass and began his postgraduate training at the Naval Medical Center in Bethesda before completing a residency in emergency medicine in a combined program with Georgetown, George Washington, and the University of Maryland. In addition to his certification in emergency medicine, he later became board certified in preventive and occupational medicine, and finally he earned a Master's of Healthcare Administration through Tulane University. Dr. Cox is no stranger to crisis and emergency readiness, and we're going to get into that today on the show. Gerry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Lee. It's great to be here with you.
You grew up in a small town called Whitman, and a few weeks ago on my way from Rhode Island up to Boston, where I teach in the Chief Medical Officer Academy, I am sure I went right by that town and missed it, as you told me that I would. But so let's start immediately with, how does a small town guy like Gerry end up at a senior level in the Veterans Administration? And what I mean by that is, when you entered medical school, what was your plan upon graduation and completion of all your training? What were you thinking back then?
Well, first of all, it's a very long time ago, and I can barely remember what I had for breakfast yesterday. So what I was thinking back then might be a little fuzzy. But what I do remember is, first of all, Whitman is a very tiny spot on the map. I think it's about 7 square miles. I had less than 10,000 people during the years I was growing up there. So it's easy to miss, even if you're on your way to Boston. And a lot of people from Boston, only 20 miles away, have never even heard of that town. I was in a position when I was graduating from college where I didn't want to have my parents sacrifice anymore to pay for my choice to go to medical school. I'd gone to this private institution. I think the tuition back then was all of, maybe $6,000 a year. And my folks had taken out loans, and I had work study and so forth to pay for that. And when I finally committed to going to medical school, I decided I wanted to find a way that I could pay for it myself. So I remember the day that the Navy healthcare recruiters came up from the Boston recruiting district to Hanover, New Hampshire. And I'd seen a flyer on a billboard somewhere, went to the hotel where they had an information session about something called the Navy Health Profession Scholarship Program, which turned out to be a full ride to any medical school that I could get accepted into. And they would pay for all tuition, fees, reimburse you for books, give you a living stipend, and so forth. So I joke, but it's only a half joking way of saying I joined the Navy for the money, because they paid for my education. And at that time, my plan was, okay, I'll do the 4 years of required payback, and then I'll go back to Massachusetts and maybe my hometown or somewhere nearby and hang out the proverbial shingle. And I think my late mother is still waiting for that to happen.
Well,
what happened instead is I paid off the initial obligation, which, by the way, the 4 year service obligation in these programs does not include postgraduate training. So I did a total of 4 years of residency. I had 4 years of payback for that, but I also, because I was allowed to do emergency medicine training in the private sector, as you pointed out, I accrued additional obligation for that. By the time I'd paid off all of my service obligation, I had 11 years of active duty. And as you and most of your listeners will know, at 20 years, one can retire from the military with a full pension and lifelong health benefits and so forth. 11 years, I thought, well, geez, this has gone pretty fast. And I was just getting to a stage in my career where I was getting some interesting job opportunities. And I committed mentally to stay for 9 more to make it to 20. And I ended up staying for 19 more and did a full 30 years of active duty before retiring in 2013.
Thank you for the background. It's certainly an interesting path for a young person to take, but obviously rewarding. And as you described or hinted at, it began to open up a variety of doors for you with this background. And one of the doors I want to walk through with you, because I find it very interesting on the last several occasions that we've spoken, is you ended up in a role at the White House as a physician there. And I want you to tell us a little bit about that and both what your wife said about all of that, and more importantly, what was happening politically when all of that unfolded for you.
Sure. Well, the White House Medical Unit is a tri-service, that is Army, Navy, and Air Force military medical organization. So this was a military assignment. I went there on orders. But as you could imagine, not an ordinary assignment and not one that is made available to very many people. The way that this happened is in the mid-90s, the White House Medical Unit for the first time began recruiting emergency physicians for the role of White House physician. For the last couple of decades before that, most White House physicians from each service had been primary care doctors, either family medicine or internal medicine. And then depending on who's in office at the time, the physicians there consult with specialists, maybe the president's or vice president's own personal physicians from before they took office, or otherwise specialists in the Washington, D.C. area, particularly at Walter Reed and Bethesda, for particular needs. But emergency medicine became seen at that time as a young and upcoming specialty, but also one that was critically important to one of the main missions of the White House Medical Unit, and that is protection, health protection of the president, the vice president, and the other principal patients. And this all stems back to 1981, the Ronald Reagan assassination attempt outside of a Hilton hotel here in Washington, D.C., where there was a White House physician on the scene at that time. But he was way back in the motorcade, a long distance from the limousine where John Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan right in front of the hotel. And so, the Secret Service agents pushed Reagan into that limo, jumped on top of him to protect him, slammed the door, and drove off in a hurry. And the doctor couldn't get anywhere near them. And so Secret Service agents made decisions about what to do with President Reagan. In fact, to divert to George Washington University Hospital to the emergency department rather than to go back to the White House because they knew that he needed emergency care. But there was no White House Medical Unit person involved in that decision. And so protocols changed, and emergency medicine became seen as a desirable skill set for White House physicians to have. So in the mid-90s, as I mentioned, for the first time, it was the Navy's turn to fill a slot, and they went to the specialty leader for emergency medicine, and he looked over the roster of emergency physicians eligible for orders and so forth. And I was one of the people that was encouraged to put in an application, had to send a resume and a personal statement and all that kind of thing, and also apply for a very high-level security clearance, which it turns out is the main obstacle for even physicians and nurses to be assigned to the White House, the ability to obtain that security clearance, which is something more higher than the top secret category. And you can imagine anybody who's going to have direct, close-up, in-person access to the president has to be cleared. So I put in my application in 1996, didn't even get an interview, was honored to have been considered, and thought, okay, I'll go on with the rest of my career. And in fact, had moved back to Washington, D.C. from Pensacola, Florida at that time to pursue additional opportunities in leadership roles. And I became friends with the Navy emergency physician who was selected in 1996 for the White House physician role, a guy named Rob Darling. And Rob and I knew each other slightly through our professional community, but we had never served together. But when he came to Washington, he invited me over at the White House for lunch, gave me a tour, kept in touch. 2 years later, Rob was finishing his 2-year assignment. His orders were up and he was ready for transfer. And he contacted me. He said, Gerry, you were interested a couple of years ago. I still think you'd be great at this job. Would you please consider putting your name in this time? I said, Rob, thanks. I'm really honored, but, I'm on this different path now. I just started working for a new boss. I was moving up the ranks. And thanks, but no thanks. I think I'll keep doing what I'm doing. And about 3 months went by, and Dr. Darling contacted me a second time and said, "Hey, Gerry, we're having trouble finding somebody who would be qualified to replace me. And so I think you really should consider it." And again, I deferred and I said, I think I'm just going to continue on the pathway that I'm on. And I'm so sure they'll be able to find somebody else as good as you. Well, I couldn't that year. And Rob extended for a third year and stayed on. And then at the end of 3 years in 1999, he called me a third time. And he said, we really think that you'd be good at this. And I promised to consider it. I went home, I talked to my wife, and I said to her, I'm not really sure about this. And she said, "Gerry, you idiot. What do you want to tell your grandchildren 25 years from now?" By the way, it's been more than 25 years. I still don't have any grandchildren, but nonetheless, what do you want to tell your grandchildren in the future that you did when you're bouncing them on your knee? Do you want to tell them that you worked for the Surgeon General of the Navy, which is where I was at that time, doing some kind of policy job? Or do you want to tell them that you were a doctor to the President of the United States? And so when she put it that way, I said, you know what? Maybe I am an idiot. And I went ahead, put my package in, and the rest is history, as they say. I did get interviewed the second time and then ended up being offered the position, started in the summer of 1999, which, as you said, was a very interesting time politically in the history of our country.
Yeah. So all along while you're being recruited into this role, had you been sharing this with your wife or only at the very last offer?
No, Kathy and I have a very close relationship, and we talk through all of our major decisions. And so she supported my initial decision to stay back and to try to get into a pathway that would lead to hospital command, which is what I had in mind at that time.
So
But also,
she clearly supportive of your leadership trajectory until the moment of truth arrived, and she began to think about how the stories would unfold with the grandchildren, right?
exactly. So
Okay.
again, she's always been much more insightful than I have been in many ways.
That should be one of our leadership lessons. Make sure you surround yourself with extremely insightful people that will
There you
give
go.
you a perspective that you may not think of yourself.
There
Okay,
you
so
go.
there
Another way to
you
say that
are.
is be sure to marry above your station,
Yeah, that
as they say.
happened for sure. So there you are. All right, now you have agreed to take on this role and responsibility, and there is some significant activity happening in Washington, D.C. Tell us about your onboarding experience, if you will.
I sure will. So, as I mentioned, the year was 1999. President Bill Clinton was in office. And in late 1998, he'd been impeached. He'd been impeached over the whole scandal involving a young woman intern in the White House named Monica Lewinsky, and was perceived as inappropriate behavior by the president at that time. And so the House had impeached him right before the holidays that year. And on the day of my interview for the job of White House physician, it was January 1999, the first day of Clinton's impeachment trial in the United States Senate. So, first of all, I have a clear recollection of it being a very cold, icy January day in D.C. I was working only 6 or 7 blocks away at the Navy Bureau of Medicine. So I walked to the White House with my heavy top coat on. And I remember thinking as I'm on my way there, how is this going to go? I mean, I'm applying for a job to work in this place that is now in turmoil, and there's this national scandal going on. And do I really want to do this? So I got into the interview, and it was a multi-stage thing. The first part was, again, a very detailed security background check, face-to-face, with a plainclothes Army intelligence officer who was checking to make sure that all the answers I'd put on the written security questionnaire corresponded with what I would say when he asked me the questions face-to-face, and looking for body language and all of that. The second interview was a group interview with all of the, at that time, current White House nurses and physicians. And it was led by the number 2 guy, the deputy to the director of the medical unit, who was an Air Force doctor. And I can remember the interview was standard for the first 90% of it, right? They ask you simple questions. Oh, why do you think you're going to be good for this job? What are your qualifications? Tell us, what you like to do in your personal time, those kinds of things. And then the last question came up, and it was Dick Tubb, the deputy director, who asked it. He said, "Dr. Cox, imagine that you are a United States senator and you have to vote today on whether President Clinton should be impeached. How would you vote?" I was shocked. It's not the kind of question I expected to be asked in
No,
that setting.
that's the hell of an interview question, isn't it?
It sure is. So I thought on my feet and I came up with an answer. I thought it was a pretty good answer. I said, well, as a physician like you, I took an oath, the Hippocratic Oath, to make sure that I put the needs of my patients first. And so the needs of any patient, whether that's the president or anybody else, would be, the most important to me. Political considerations, not part of what I need to be concerned about. So I wouldn't attempt to vote on the question of his impeachment.
So is that how you answered, by saying that you would abstain from voting?
I answered by saying it wouldn't be my role as a White House physician to have an opinion on whether or not the president should be impeached, because
Let's stay on that for just a second.
okay.
Obviously, there's been a lot of activity recently around what are the protocols in caring for the President of the United States, and to what standard do physicians hold relative to the President? So, with that logic, there's a certain degree of politicization of medical care. And as a physician who wants to honor the oath, and look, you had hinted that you considered even backing out as you entered the role with this impeachment trial ongoing. But knowing you as I do, and knowing you're a very responsible and ethically driven person, you weren't going to back out, and I don't think your wife was going to let you back out, for that matter.
Probably
But
not.
but there you are, contemplating all of this activity, and here we are today, and in the modern time of 2025, and people are still questioning, how do the White House physicians uphold their oaths relative to the person they're caring for, as opposed to the position and or politics that they display. Any insight into this? Have things changed? Do you have any awareness of how this has evolved over the last several decades?
Well, one of the main differences between being a physician to a patient like the president or vice president and being the physician to an ordinary citizen is that your patient's right to healthcare privacy is different. The interpretation has been for some time now that the public has a right to know about any health condition that the president might have that could affect his ability to carry out his duties. And this goes back many, many decades. In fact, probably over 100 years, to when Woodrow Wilson was the president, had a stroke and was debilitated. And it was believed that his wife, Edith, basically ran the country for the last years of the Wilson presidency in the 19 teens. And of course, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president, debilitated by polio, served part of a fourth term and died in office, but again had a spouse and a support staff that protected him and kept some of his health information away from the public. And in fact, he was rarely photographed in his wheelchair. And usually, the press, the photographers were instructed to take their pictures from an angle that wouldn't show the wheelchair. And then think about when John F. Kennedy was in office, a young man, supposedly vigorous, but also plagued by Addison's disease. And so he had definitely some serious health concerns, and so on. And we already talked a little bit about the Reagan assassination attempt and its impact. So there is a political aspect, if you will, to caring for a patient where there's going to be a public briefing after his annual physical at Walter Reed. The head White House physician is going to have to make a statement, of course, cleared through all of the public relations and spokespeople for the White House. But he's going to have to make a statement about the results of that physical and the outcome of the president's health assessment. So that is very different. And thinking about the recent events, like you mentioned, about concerns about President Biden's cognitive decline, alleged to have occurred during his last years in office, the relative opaqueness of President Trump's medical history. Right, he hasn't really shared personal health records, and even the public statements by his physicians after his annual physicals have been brief and lacking in detail. So, yeah, that is true. Whereas we as physicians strive to protect the privacy of our patients, and as the Hippocratic Oath tells us, to serve their needs. In this case, there's another set of needs that needs to be met.
So let's go back to your interview,
Okay.
and you're being asked if you were in the Senate today, what you would vote for relative to President Clinton to be impeached or not, and you answered that effectively. But then at that moment, right now, you're moving forward in the interview. So what happened after you completed the interview and secured the role?
So the first time I answered that question, I tried to use the Hippocratic Oath as my defense. I was told I needed to answer the question. And the second time, I tried another tack. I said, I'm a commissioned naval officer. I took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution, and my duty is to the commander in chief and to the Constitution and to the country that it guides. So again, I wouldn't be in a position to vote on whether the president should be impeached or not. As a military officer, that's not my role. And they said, no, that doesn't work either. You have to answer the question. And so I was forced to answer the question. The third time I said, well, okay, based on what I know, and I'm thinking in my head, okay, here it goes. Based on what I know, what I've read publicly, then I believe the president should be impeached, and I would vote yes to impeach him. He engaged in behavior that if I had done this, as a naval officer, fraternization with a younger subordinate, then I'd lose my job and I'd probably lose my commission. So I figured, well, that's the end of this interview, and I'll go back to whatever I was supposed to be doing that day. But in fact, they offered me the position anyway, and I realized after that the reason for this strange and difficult line of questioning was first to make sure that the individual standing there for the interview was keeping up on current events, had some clue about what was going on in the White House and in the country at that time. So I guess I passed that test. And secondly, of course, how one would react under stress, right? How you're going to handle yourself when faced with a stressful question. So I think that's what was going on. And in any event, by the end of the day, I had a tentative offer. And then several months later, started at the White House in that role. It took actually about another 8 or 9 months to get that Yankee white security clearance. But when I reported for duty in June of 1999, by this time, Clinton had been cleared by the Senate, right? He was not convicted at impeachment, and the country was moving on, and he was entering the last 18 months of his second term and trying to burnish his legacy and kind of get back on track and help the rest of the country forget all of that other stuff that had happened.
That's an amazing experience, and I think your wife is right, and your grandchildren not only are going to enjoy the stories once you finally have grandchildren, but now it's recorded for posterity. So their grandkids themselves may actually get to hear some of these stories. So rather cool. Well, so let me bring this back to the leadership lessons that we're trying to share in this podcast. It seems to me that your emergency medicine training actually prepared you for the interview and the style of interview questions for getting security clearance and all of the other obstacles you had to overcome. But at the end of the day, your reflection, it sounds like that they were testing your mettle. They were testing you under stress, under fire, if you will, and asking you some very challenging questions, particularly about how you might vote if you were in a Senate seat and had the opportunity to vote. And they wouldn't let go, right? They wanted you to answer the question. It's just like running a code, and you start with one rhythm and you end up with some epi and another rhythm. And next thing you know, you're doing compressions, but you don't stop and you just keep focusing on what's in front of you, which is to pursue to the end and get to the better outcome. So I think as physicians, we are very trained for leadership. We don't always recognize that, but our training in clinical spaces prepares us for some stressful considerations. And that's notwithstanding your military training at all, which only doubles your effectiveness. So I think that's part of it. And the other part of it is embedded in the answer to the question on the first two occasions, which is listening to your inner voice about your values. On the one hand, you're a physician and you hold a certain oath and credo and an honor to the responsibility of being a physician, and you attempted to answer in that way. And then you came up with an additional, just as meritorious way. I'm a military officer and I have an oath to a constitution. So I have a Hippocratic oath that's between me, my God, my deity, and my patient, and I have an oath to this country to uphold the Constitution and act in a way. And so it says a lot about your intrinsic values, which is the broader lesson for our younger listeners, that in times of stress, your true north is your internal compass, your values, your pledges, your commitments, and you have to be unwavering to as far as you can bear. And obviously, there are times where things are beyond our ability to reconcile. So appreciate this, because this is a big lesson learned. And I want to march forward in your career and we're going to go past some of the work that you did, but I'm going to mention it. You served as a COO at the U.S. Naval Hospital in Okinawa, the CEO of a naval hospital at Camp Lejeune, and also a chief medical officer of the U.S. Naval Forces in Central Command with the Fifth Fleet. And I know, having talked with you, all of those have had an impact on your career, both personally and professionally. And I want our listeners to know that you not just were in the White House and as a naval officer, but you also managed acute care for our active servicemen and women. And then you got into the working at the VA administration, the Veterans Administration healthcare system. And one of the most important lessons that you shared with me was the notion of the VA as a political football. And I would love for you to elaborate with our listeners what you learned about that and in the management of crisis, which is like we talked about hurricane readiness and being prepared for unexpected things. You learned a lot. So share with us your learnings about political crises and the VA.
Sure.
Agreed.
Regarding veterans and the notion of veterans care being a political football or veterans themselves being caught in the middle, it's because politicians on both sides of the aisle want to be seen as supporting veteran issues and veterans themselves. And for the most part, issues about veterans in this country and the oversight committees and the Congress, the House and Senate and VA oversight committees tend to be more nonpartisan than others. But each of the two main parties has a very different idea about what it means to support veterans, especially when it comes to health care. So the Veterans Health Administration, the largest part of the Department of Veterans Affairs, is the health system. The Veterans Health Administration, one of the three major subparts of VA, is easily 85 or 90% of the whole organization. Over 400,000 employees, 170 medical centers, 1,200 outpatient sites of care, 9 million enrolled veterans. So it's an enormous system, but it is, by and large, what the VA does. So not only is VHA the largest integrated health system in the country, it is also a public taxpayer-funded system, which means it's a proxy for quote-unquote socialized medicine, and often compared to the national health system in the UK or the Canadian health system, and so forth. There are both supporters and opponents of the concept of socialized medicine. One party tends to favor strengthening that publicly funded health system, and particularly the VA's unique ability to serve the needs of veterans related to their military service with such capabilities as polytrauma care, amputee care, special expertise in traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, other mental health disorders, substance use disorder, a blind rehab, et cetera, et cetera. And the other party tends to favor more access to private sector care under the guise of quote-unquote choice for veterans. And there actually was legislation passed in 2014 called the Veterans Choice Act. And in 2019, a follow-on piece of legislation called the Mission Act even strengthened the ability of veterans to seek care outside the system and have the VA pay for it. So private sector care, or what's called community care, tends to be more expensive than care provided by the VA, although it's hard to make direct apples-to-apples cost comparisons because the funding of these two systems is so different. And also, advocates of veterans' choice, quote-unquote, believe that private sector care is both more accessible and of better quality, although factually, neither of those things is true. There are well-published data in the literature that show that VA care is at least as good as, and in many cases better than, in the private sector. So there's this constant tension between these two viewpoints, and politicians and powerful lobbying forces and veteran service organizations are on one or the other side of this issue. And everybody agrees you need to have a backup to the VA health system. It can't be everywhere. There are veterans that live in highly rural areas that are hundreds of miles from the nearest VA hospital or clinic. And so you have to have community care as a wraparound, just as in the military health system, TRICARE serves as a wraparound for what the Army, Navy, and Air Force can provide through their own facilities. But community care can't replace that special expertise that the VA system provides. And these tensions between the two sets of forces have persisted across multiple administrations, both the Senate and the House. Right now, we have unified government in the sense that the Republican Party is in charge of the White House and the House and the Senate. And still, these tensions, these discussions occur within committees and across the aisle. So that's what I mean when I say veterans often are caught in the middle. Everybody wants to serve their needs, but that understanding of how to serve veterans' needs is very different depending on where you sit.
Yeah, no, that very helpful to hear that explanation. And to so, but you let me ask you this: when you began in your roles at the VA, were you aware of those types of dynamics, or was it on the job training in terms of framing how different political coalitions might manage or publicize or undermine, these activities? How did you learn about all of that? Was it on the job, or you had some preparation?
I would have to say, Lee, I was pretty naive when I started at VA in early 2014. I often joke about how I wish I had taken more government courses in college or civics classes in high school. Just to understand how government works and the balance of powers across the three co-equal branches and all that sort of thing. But I also remember that I arrived in early 2014, and only about 3 months later, there was a national crisis that erupted over access to care for veterans. And it was stimulated in large part by a Republican congressman from the Florida Panhandle named Jeff Miller. Congressman Miller was the chair of the House VA committee, and I remember particularly hearing where he was holding up a piece of paper that he said was a list of the names of 40 veterans who had died while waiting for the VA to provide them health care out in Phoenix, Arizona, the Phoenix healthcare system. So this notion that veterans were dying while waiting for care was instilled in the public mind. And I remember talking to my boss, the person who hired me as a complete stranger from outside the VA system, only a few months earlier, and saying, doesn't he realize that that the Congress should be helping us, right? The Congress should be helping make sure that the VA has the resources it needs and gets public support. But I was really taken aback by this notion that there are opponents, and depending on which party's in power, the other party is always going to be trying to make the administration look bad. And so, again, this gets back to that political football notion. In this case, Republicans in the House, there was a Democratic a Democratic president, Barack Obama, in the White House. And so the Republican Party was taking every opportunity it could to try to make the Obama administration look weak or ineffective. And this whole national crisis erupted over access to care. The narrative went on that there were VA healthcare executives that were corrupt and were falsifying wait time data to make it look like they were seeing patients faster than they were able to. And the added thing was because if they made the numbers look better, they made their record look better, and they'd be eligible for these big bonuses every year, performance bonuses. So the VA had established wait time standards that were unrealistic. I think at the time it was 10 or 14 days for a first primary care appointment, which no health system in the country was able to do, or probably can still do today. And so when veterans couldn't get seen within that amount of time, again, they could get referred to the outside, or they get put on a waiting list. And this notion that people were making up numbers to make themselves look better was largely unproven, or largely disproven later through medical inspector general investigations. But the narrative persists even till today. So it was a very challenging time. A lot of people lost their jobs. The secretary of VA at that time was a man named Eric Shinseki, retired Army four-star general and former Army chief of staff. He was forced to resign over this scandal. The CEO of the health system, the undersecretary for health, was forced to resign. The deputy undersecretary for health was forced to resign, and multiple heads rolled. And I was the new guy. I'd been there, as I said, about 3 months, thinking, oh my gosh, what have I stepped into now? Maybe I made a bad decision about joining this organization. And then I pretty quickly realized that, you know what, it's a good time to be the new guy, because I can't possibly be held responsible for any of the stuff that has happened over previous months and years. And in fact, it's probably a good time for somebody to be able to infuse an outside perspective and maybe some new ideas and some new energy into solving these problems. So
Yeah, no,
that's
that
the way I started out.
and that's a great lesson for our listeners, the courage to take on health systems and hospitals and situations where less than optimal, but that's where change occurs. That's where you have an opportunity to make a big difference. And kudos to you for doing that. There are two themes that I want to pick up on, and then we only have just a couple of minutes left to rapid fire some questions and answers. You hinted at yeah, it was on the job training. Well, you didn't hint at it. It was pretty obvious. It was on the job training. And again, your background as a physician, particularly in emergency medicine, and being able to learn quickly on your feet. And I think that physicians have the aptitude and the capability of learning things that they don't otherwise know. But it also suggests that our young folks who are going through medical school or early stages of their career and beginning to think about leadership roles, regardless of whether they're in the armed services or the federal healthcare systems or the private sector, you know, whether or not they should be paying attention to these larger geopolitical issues, economic issues, because while the VA access narrative may persist historically, it is quite clear relative to the White House and the care of the president or the vice president, there is a politicization of healthcare, and it's going back and forth, and different sides are taking different positions about what they want or don't want, or how to um, display the other side's inadequacies or incompetencies. So I guess this question boils down to, do you believe our young physician leaders need to be thinking broadly about geopolitics, United States politics, economic forces at play, or rather keep their head down onto the systems and structures that they inherit, like running a hospital and quality and safety? How do you feel about that now?
Well, there are so many factors and so many influences on the practice of medicine and the medical profession in our country nowadays that it's hard to know what one should focus on. I think the most important thing that I'd advise young physician leaders to pay attention to is to remain true to their principles and their values. And you touched on this earlier. I think if you have a well-defined and well understood set of personal and professional values, you can always fall back on that. And they should be centered around making decisions based on what's best for your patients and making sure that that is always at the center of what we do as physicians, to never forget the reasons that we entered the medical profession.
100% agree. And I think this, you have helped me tremendously in the evolution of this show. And again, the theme here is hurricane readiness and emergency preparedness. There are too many things to pay attention to, and you can only pay attention to so much. But this show hopefully will distill some key lessons to people actively in the chief medical officer role and those who think about the role. That the If we bring stories, narrative, lessons learned, exactly the one you just said, in the moment of truth, stay true to your principles, to your oath, to your values. That is your North Star when the Category 5 event is coming for you. I absolutely agree. Listen, our time is almost up, and I do want to ask. You are active in a consultant role. Tell us in just a brief moment what the role is about and how we can get in touch with you.
Sure. Yes, I have set up a small consulting business on the side. I'm working with one particular commercial company that provides digital patient engagement solutions for hospitals, both inpatient settings, the emergency department, and another setting, and a rounding tool, a digital rounding tool for use by healthcare professionals in the hospital setting. So uh, these solutions that they have been shown to have a major impact on not just patient engagement and patient satisfaction, but on quality and safety outcomes. I mean, reducing the risk of falls, helping to reduce hospital-acquired infections, and so forth. So I'm enjoying my role as a part-time strategic advisor to that company. My consulting firm is called Veteran and Military Health Leadership Consulting, LLC, or VMHLC. And so if anybody would like to contact me, just to drop an email to gcox at vmhlc.com, and that'll reach me.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, our time has come to a close. And although I could easily listen to your stories for another whole hour, we'll have to give it a wrap right now. It has been a pleasure and fantastic to hear about your physician leadership journey and throughout the military, the VA, and the White House, and the insights that you have about managing during a political crisis. And given all of the wild times that we live in, it is clear that this show was built for folks like you to share these stories, not just to your grandchildren, but to our young rising physician leaders. The insights about how to serve the country, how to honor the commitments we make to our patients and the institutions that we serve. On behalf of all the listeners, I thank you for your service. There's no way we could have done this without folks like you. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for being on the show, Gerry.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I really have had a great time talking with you.
Thank you. Well, everyone, you have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the role of the Chief Medical Officer. If you want access to the hottest items on physician leadership, and especially if you want to become a CMO, visit our new website, thefirechiefcmo.com, and sign up with us. You leave your comments with us, tell us what the next hot mess is in healthcare we should be talking about, and what physician leaders should be doing about it. You know I love talking with physician leaders and chief medical officers from all over the United States, so please feel free to connect, leave your reviews, leave your comments, and share this with your colleagues. And in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, let's be careful out there.